Test, 1, 2, test, 1, 2, test, 1, 2. Is that loud enough for you? Is that loud enough? Yeah? Okay, cool. Good afternoon and welcome to the inaugural Yodi Talks session. All right. At CSUSB, California State University, San Bernardino. Welcome. This event and future events are designed to engage students in listening to expert opinion and expressing thoughts about that expert opinion. So it's in the format of TED Talks, if you're familiar with that. So we're going to have a great speaker, Dr. Levin, who will be introduced by our colleague, Dr. Davis, in a minute, presenting his opinion on the topic of emerging issues on hate and extremism. That's the topic for today. And I'm just here. My name is Cesar Caballero, Dean and University Librarian, Chair of the University Diversity Committee, to open up the session and to tell you that this session is pretty much was put together by a subcommittee of the University Diversity Committee. Let me ask the folks from the University Diversity Committee and the Yodi Talk Subcommittee to stand up to be recognized. Please give them a random applause. Thank you. Thank you, folks. Thank you all. These are the folks that work extra in addition to their day job to put these things together. So without more ado, welcome everyone, and thank you for your participation. Let me introduce our colleague, Dr. Claudia Davis, member of the UDC committee and Yodi Talks.
Thank you, Cesar. Okay, welcome everyone. And just to echo what Dean Caballero said, it is very interactive. So we're actually looking forward. I feel I have to turn around in full circles to get everyone. We're actually looking forward to some engaging questions and or thoughts that you, the students and or colleagues, will provide to our speaker, who we're just so thankful that he's here in our midst. And allow me to do this introduction. Professor Brian Levin, fabulous individual. He's a criminologist and an attorney, and he is here, one of our own, if you will, at CSUSB. And I was struck, a few months ago, I happened to turn on CNN, and they said, and we have a guest speaker from CSUSB, and I just about dropped on the floor. I couldn't believe that it was from our university, and he is an outstanding speaker. So much so that he has been reached out to speak at various organizations, and I will give you a little bit more. He is director and the center of our study of hate and extremism at CSUSB, and he also discusses legal issues with regards to international and domestic issues and terrorism. He also was a policeman on the beat in New York City, so he has some street cred, if you will. Professor Levin has also received his law degree from Stanford, where he received the Block Liberties Award, and he graduated summa cum laude from University of Pennsylvania, one of the great schools, if you will. He also has an honors and BA in history. He's the author, editor of many, many books. He's a prolific writer. He also has many articles, training manuals. He also does court briefs, Supreme Court briefs, and his area is extremism and hate crimes. He also has spoken before Congress, state legislators. He has run the gamut of speaking to various groups. The one thing that I might want to add in particular was that he speaks to Rachel Maddow, he speaks to NBC, he spoke to CBS, he also spoke to, on the Today Show, Tavis Smiley. So he's run the gamut with regards to where he has been invited to speak. Of late, though, was that one of his studies on hate crime was picked up by the Republican debate as a question, if you will, and it was cited by the New York Times. So again, his work is being well read, and allow me to introduce my colleague, Dr. Brian Levin.
Can I go home now? Thank you so much for having me here today. Dr. Davis, President Morales, Dean Caballero, the folks at the UDC campus, and also law enforcement. Boy, are we lucky to have you. And if the events... If the events of December 2nd showed anything, and this is very tough for an NYPD guy to say, that we have the finest law enforcement here in the Inland Empire anywhere in the world. They showed it. So thank you so much. And for my students, remember they are armed with tasers, so no tough questions. Isn't that what Donald Trump said to the Scarborough folks? No tough questions. Anyway, thank you so much for having me here, and again to our friends on the Palm Desert campus. I'm here to offer today some observations relating to hate and extremism as part of the director of our center, which has been here for 17 years. Wait a minute, Dean Muhammad, thank you for coming. He's the guy who keeps the lights on in my building, so I got to make sure thank you so much, thank you. And when I do get any complaints, when I stand up against Islamophobia and they say that, I can't believe our tax dollars are paying your salary, you should be kicked out of here, I always say, please refer any complaints to Dean Muhammad. Don't laugh, it happened. But thank you so much for having me here. First, let me say what an honor it is to be the inaugural speaker. If nothing else, it means I'm better than all the ones that came before. Celebrating California State University's 50th anniversary. A lot can happen in 50 years. 5 decades is a long time, and it is time for us to take stock both of what our achievements are and what this milestone means for the future, and what these accomplishments that we have attained collectively, not only as a university, but as a people. 5 decades ago, 3 civil rights martyrs were viciously taken in an attack by the Ku Klux Klan, and they were recently honored with the highest civilian award that President Obama could give, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I wrote about this for the Huffington Post on a front page piece 2 years ago. They came to Mount Nebo Baptist Church in rural Mississippi during Freedom Summer to register people for voting initiatives. For Jews, Christians, and Muslims as well, Mount Nebo is a very special place. After Moses liberated his people from slavery and delivered the 10 Commandments, and I just found out from my rabbi it is in fact 10, he could see the promised land from the 2,600-foot-high ridge in western Jordan, but he could not enter it. Contrary to Moses' plans, God had a different plan for him, and he said, it was time for you to close your eyes and come to heaven with me. Now, one thing that people don't realize about Moses, even at 120 years old, he didn't want to go, and he actually punched an angel in the eye who came to take him away, but eventually he acquiesced. Just south of Mount Nebo Baptist Church, just off of Highway 19, lies Rock Cut Road. This short, unlit road curves slightly past tall, thin trees, and the top branches of which rustle gently in the nighttime wind, like outstretched hands striving for the unreachable stars. It was a languid Freedom Summer evening in June of 1964. Earlier that day, an idealistic college student from New York wrote his last words to his parents, and I'm gonna read it. And that, by the way, that's why I carry a flat screen, so I can actually, at 52, can read some of this. Dear Mom and Dad, I've arrived safely in Meridian, Mississippi. This is a wonderful town and the weather is fine. I wish you were here. The people in this city are wonderful, and our reception was very good. All my love, Andy. June 21st, 1964, though, went from a night of hope to one of terror. As the 3 civil rights workers from CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, James Earl Chaney, 21, Andrew Goodman, 20, and Michael Schwerner, 24, were shot dead by a mob of Klansmen and local sheriff on the narrow Rock Cut Road just outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. James Chaney, the only African American and native Mississippian there, was shot 3 times and brutally beaten, while Goodman and Schwerner fell from a single shot to the heart. They went missing, and it was one of the most expansive FBI searches of the 20th century. Philadelphia, ironically, means brotherly love, and the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, houses the Liberty Bell. And on the Liberty Bell is inscribed a quote from Leviticus, and it said, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." Less than 4 years later, Martin Luther King referenced the promised land that was seen but not attained from Mount Nebo. And he said in an address, "If I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, 'Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in?' He said, I would take my mental flight by Egypt, and I would watch God's children in their magnificent trek from the dark dungeons of Egypt through, or rather across, the Red Sea, through the wilderness, on towards the promised land. And in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there." He then went and lectured about how he'd go throughout history. But he continued and ended with this. He said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." The next night, April 4th, 1968, the Reverend Martin Luther King was slain as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. That evening, rioting broke out in cities across the United States, except in Indianapolis. There, Bobby Kennedy, in a campaign that stands in stark contrast to today's rather disappointing primary season, told a stunned crowd of the tragedy that befell our nation. And he said, "I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering that the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country towards greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred towards one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land with an effort to understand compassion and love. He closed by saying this: "Let's dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and to make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people." 2 months later, after winning the California primary, Senator Kennedy himself was struck down by bullets by an assassin at the Ambassador Hotel, now a high school just 60 miles west of here. Unfortunately, that was not the last act of extremist violence our region had to endure. Last October, I had the privilege of testifying in Washington before Congress, and I told them about the terror threat matrix that exists today. And I said, in today's splintered socio-political landscape, increasingly sophisticated organized groups also share the stage with angry, unstable, or disenchanted loners, and with smaller, informal groups. These latter actors may sculpt idiosyncratic hatreds online, become operational, and even recruit with little external backing. The United States faces multiple severe risk factors and a diverse set of emerging contemporary actors in the areas of mass terrorism, with shots on goal increasingly coming from across both the ideological, geographical, and competency spectrum. I then described the most prominent threat, which is coming from violent Salafist jihadists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And I said, the catalytic civil wars in Syria and Iraq, a well-organized and geographically expanding domestic and overseas ISIS presence, and let me say Daesh in case they want to use the video, and the most sophisticated use of the internet ever for terrorist recruitment and training is indeed the most profound, though hardly the only threat to our national security. Earlier this month, James R. Clapper, Director of National Intelligence, who's actually in Southern California today, warned of a similar threat. Unpredictable instability has become the new normal, he said, and this trend will continue for the foreseeable future. Violent extremists are operationally active in about 40 countries. 7 countries are experiencing a collapse of central government authority. 14 others face regime-threatening or violent instability or both. Another 59 countries face a significant risk of instability through 2016. As a non-state actor, ISIS displays unprecedented online proficiency. The day of the Paris attacks, I told the Riverside Press Enterprise, we have a significant terrorist threat facing the United States, and the last thing we should do is say this is a Russian problem or an Egyptian problem or a French problem. This is a harbinger of the future. Little did I know that just 35 days after my testimony warning of this threat, Al-Qaeda and ISIS-inspired extremists, armed with bombs and assault rifles, murdered 14 of our neighbors, our public servants, and wounded 22 more at a holiday party in the most deadly act of domestic terrorism since 9/11. The married couple, which included one of our own graduates, left a 6-month-old and even fired on a fellow worshiper from their very own mosque. 3 killed immigrated to the United States to escape persecution elsewhere. Let's take a moment to honor the memories of this diverse group of public servants. Robert Adams, 40. Isaac Amanios, 60. Benita Bet-Badal, 46. Harry Bowman, 46. Sierra Claiborne, 27. Juan Espinoza, 50. Aurora Godoy, 26. Shannon Johnson, 46. Larry David Kaufman, 42. Daniel Mines, 58. Tim Nguyen, 31. Nicholas Dalasanos, 52. Yvette Velasco, 27. Michael Wetzel, 37. The study of hate crime and terrorism is limited by definitional issues, incomplete data, and the infusion of political agendas, or worse yet, bigotry, which further obfuscate issues. Let's start with some definitions. Terrorism is the use or threatened use of force to intimidate a population or subgroup for social or political change. According to the Global Terrorism Database, in the United States since 1995, 3,500 casualties, that is death and injuries, have come from violent Salafist jihadist attacks, and 984 from far right-wing extremists. But a handful of mass attacks, like 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombing, or the Oklahoma City bombing, have dominated these figures. Since 9/11, more fatalities have actually come from right-wing extremists, 51, with 45 fatalities coming from violent Salafist jihadists, 14 alone coming here in San Bernardino. According to the New America Foundation, since 9/11, there were 502 extremists charged or killed, of which 320 were violent Salafist jihadists, and 182 other, mostly far right wing. Remember, we're not talking about our conservative friends of goodwill. However, there's been an increase over the last few years of violent Salafist jihadists, with 62 last year and only 3 others. At the beginning of the year, there were 900 open FBI investigations in all 50 states, primarily involving ISIS. If we shift the timeline back, however, from 1980 to 2005, right-wing extremists committed more terrorist plots and attacks, 24%, compared to 6% for Muslim extremists, 7% for Jewish ones, and Latinos, 49%, mostly those fighting for Puerto Rican independence and affiliated with the FALN, which is no longer operational. With respect to hate crime, the government has only collected figures since the early 1990s. And the participation has been spotty, with states like Mississippi with millions of residents reporting 0 hate crimes or 4 in any given year. What is a hate crime? A hate crime, definitionally, is a criminal act where the target is intentionally selected because of the actual or perceived group status of another. These categories include race, religion, sexual orientation, national origin, gender, gender identity, disability, and others. In 1993, a unanimous Supreme Court, in an opinion written by Reagan appointee, Chief Justice William Rehnquist, a Stanford grad, ruled 9-0 that hate crime penalty enhancement laws were thoroughly constitutional. These laws are laws that heighten the penalty for an underlying criminal act when a victim or a target is intentionally selected because of group status. In 2009, I was in Washington when President Obama signed the Shepherd Bird Hate Crime Act, named after a gay college student and an African American who was mercilessly dragged behind a pickup truck by chains and decapitated. I had the opportunity to talk to members from both families. That act closed loopholes that made it possible for people to commit hate crimes and escape prosecution under hate crime law. I was also involved with trying to get the federal law changed for many, many years and wrote a couple of briefs in the Wisconsin versus Mitchell Wisconsin versus Mitchell case, which, as I mentioned previously, came down in 1993. Currently, there are 5 states that don't have hate crime laws. Wyoming, ironically, where Matthew Shepard was murdered, Arkansas, South Carolina, Georgia, and Indiana. And indeed, just this week, the bill in Indiana appears to have failed. One other state that doesn't have a hate crime law, South Carolina, where 9 church parishioners were murdered at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston last summer. Interestingly enough, when I was on Tavis Smiley, I had the opportunity to talk about him and the white supremacist who murdered these innocent churchgoers and stayed with them for an hour while they prayed. And I said, you know, when we talk about stereotypes about the African American community, I have been fortunate to spend quite a few instances in African American churches. Much to my rabbi's chagrin, perhaps more time there than with him. They cheer more. What can I say? He did tell me, however, next time you make a public presentation, you should do more than talk about the law. And you should do more than talk about public policy. He said, you should do what I do, and that is to tell people to go out and do good deeds each and every day, because that pleases God. I said, but that's your place, not mine. He said, I'm telling you to do it. So I said, okay, maybe I better listen. It's true. He just told me on Saturday. Unfortunately, one of the things that we've seen, and one of the things I even testified before Congress about, within this terror threat is also the risk of attacks against our fellow citizens who are also Muslim. According to private monitoring groups, attacks against mosques have hit a high since they started collecting data in 2009. I started getting calls from a cross-section of researchers and journalists saying, are we actually having more attacks against Muslim citizens here in the United States? And I am proud to have done something that academic researchers have done for decades, and that is to do research to confirm what common sense has already told us. In the month after the Paris attacks, which were on November 13th, 37 anti-Muslim attacks occurred in the United States. And I want to be clear on this, because there has been criticism in some parts of the political media. I stand by the research 110%. We didn't get paid by anyone. We didn't consort with anyone. We used publicly available information, model penal code standards, and FBI definitions to arrive at this conclusion. And the reason we did it is because the FBI data lags over a year. And there was an immediate question as to what was going on. And one thing I will say to critics is you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. I stand by these attacks. And the fact that some of these individuals wanted to remain anonymous after being shot at coming out of mosques is not a sign that it wasn't a hate crime. It's a sign that they were concerned that they could be further victimized. These 37 attacks in the month after November 13th, the non-calendar month, compared to an average of 12.6 in the 5-year monthly calendar average of the previous 5 years. But I would argue that these hate crimes, which are relatively infrequent compared to many other things, is only the tip of the iceberg. And as social scientists, we need to look further. According to Gallup, 43% of Americans harbor some type of prejudice against Muslims. 9% extreme prejudice. And this is self-reporting. In other words, they asked people, how much do you hate Muslims? And 9% of Americans said, a whole darn lot. That is worrisome, because what we are seeing, not only from these polls, but in the discourse, including by presidential candidates, and this is not an issue of party. I want to be very clear here. Our center is nonpartisan, and we go after extremists on the left, animal liberation folks, and anyone else that addresses the objective criteria that we lay out, and that is people who advocate violence and extrajudicial force, and those who promote bigotry and who seek to undermine or destroy the institutions of our pluralistic civil democracy. That's it. And I would encourage you to read some statements by President George Bush after 9/11, when he visited a mosque and criticized those who would discriminate against Muslim Americans as being un-American themselves. If he were present today with those statements, I don't know if he could get reelected. In 2014, there were 5,462 hate crimes reported in the United States. This compares to a Bureau of Justice Statistics estimate done through victimization surveys, and I want to be careful here. The 5,462 refers to those crimes that are actually reported to police and categorized as such by law enforcement. Bureau of Justice Statistics calls tens of thousands of households nationwide. They've been doing this since 1973. And they have found that in the most recent years that they have conducted their research, that the numbers are closer to 294,000 annually, a big gap, similar to the gap I see between what I hope the Angels will do at the beginning of baseball season and what they do in October. Obviously, we have some Angels fans here with broken hearts as well. Yes, the comments on Rate My Professor about me mentioning the Angels in class are completely true. In the United States, 17% of the reported hate crimes, that's out of the 5,462, were directed against religious biases. 58% were directed against Jews, 16% directed against Muslims. I put this in the research, and this was all picked up by the New York Times. It was on the front page of the Huffington Post. We were very transparent with regard to our data. For those who say, wait, there is these anti-Semitic attacks, I would say, yes, you're absolutely right. And that's not a nice thing. But the difference is, if you look at the data, particularly let's look at the Gallup data, those who admitted to harboring the most extreme anti-Semitic views numbered 1%. Those who admitted to harboring the most extreme anti-Muslim views, 9%. 43% in total said they harbored some degree of prejudice against Muslims. Only between 15 and 18% were directed against, for instance, Jews and Buddhists and others. So while hate crimes against any group is a terrible thing, there is not the effort to exclude these other groups from meaningful participation in civil society. Indeed, among the groups that are most noted as having the least percentage of the electorate saying they would vote for an otherwise qualified candidate for president who held their same views, it was Muslim Americans. Last week, the Southern Poverty Law Center, where I used to work and have been accused of still working at, it's in some columns. I don't work there. I haven't worked there since 1995 and 96. Found that there were 892 hate groups in the United States. That's up 14% from the previous year of 784. And this comes after a 3-year decline. The year before, in 2014, there were 72 Klan groups in the United States. And I'm at the age where as a researcher, I've been to most of the rallies from a lot of these groups, believe it or not. Let me save you a trip. They kind of say the same thing over and over again. This year, there were 190 Klan groups, up from 72 the year before. And that's coming directly out of the debates over the Confederate rebel flag. Black separatists rose from 113 to 180. Anti-government groups have increased from 874 to 998. One of the things that we've seen in the United States, and I think that's something that does not bode well for the future and civil society, is that Americans' trust in the institutions that held us together has precipitously dropped over recent decades. That includes mainstream media, academia, the Supreme Court, Congress, law enforcement, medicine, and the financial system. It has plummeted. Well, what are some of the other causes of hate and extremism in the United States? Well, there's unease over terrorism. In many polls, terrorism is the top issue, depending on when it's taken. Immigration, changing economics. We are shifting from an industrial to a service to an information economy. The largest companies in the United States that are worth hundreds of billions of dollars, Apple, Google, Facebook, now eclipse some of the companies that were the top companies when I was growing up, like Ford Motor Company, which is only worth tens of billions of dollars. What else do we see? We see an upsurge in the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories. It's not enough to say that we disagree with a policy of President Obama's. We have to delegitimize his place as the president executive of the United States by saying he's not really a citizen or he's a secret Muslim, as if there's something wrong with having a faith that is different. These conspiracy theories are accepted by millions of people in the double digit percentage-wise. What else do we have? We have a concomitant decline in discourse. Trust me. I got a bunch of emails after I appeared on the Bill Maher show, one of which I can't repeat because there were so many epithets in it. But after calling me various bodily functions and bodily parts and said, how could anyone hire me? And I just say, I defer to my colleagues here who made the decision. I had nothing to do with it. And said that they hoped that my children would be blown up and the blood and their body parts strewn across my tidy suit. Can you imagine what it's like for someone who walks around town in a hijab or exits a mosque? But I also got an email from a fellow in Yemen who thanked me for trying to explain what Islam meant to him. And what he said, like your faith. In fact, we have the same prophets. And he wrote, whether it be the extremists or the critics, he said they should actually read the Quran where it says, if you take one life, it's as if you take the life of the whole world. This decline in discourse is exhibited in certain segments of social and news media. I want to close with one final observation on hate, speech, and college campuses. 5 decades ago, in the California public university system, the free speech movement was born right here in California. In recent years, a Pulitzer Prize Washington Post photojournalist, Michel DeCilly, was disinvited from Syracuse University over fear that he covered Ebola. Other folks subject to censorship and disinvitation include former NYPD Commissioner Ray Kelly, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, comedian Bill Maher, who cussed at me on national television, International Monetary Fund Christine Lagarde, columnist George Will, and ironically, UC Chancellor Robert Birgeneau. In West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the U.S. Supreme Court said, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, is it that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or by act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us. Recently, a faculty member was dismissed from a college for wearing a hijab in solidarity with Muslims and making a statement about the continuity of God. In Missouri, a faculty member threatened physical force against a student journalism in a public place covering protests. If our democracy and our educational system is going to mean anything, it is exposing our students and ourselves to divergent, even uncomfortable ideas. I think the American university system has failed in that regard, and we should redouble our efforts. I can't recall the last time we had a conservative speaker of goodwill on campus, except the one that I meekly invited to my class. If there's one area where the far right-wing media, a sometime echo chamber for the most horrendous and defamatory critiques of particularly of the first African-American sitting president, if there's one area where they are correct, it is that conservative viewpoints are stifled or ridiculed on college campuses. There are many of them that I diverge from. But we must not only be a bastion of diverse people, as we are so successfully, but also a bastion of diverse ideas, as well from all sides of the political spectrum. As Dr. King and President Obama have reminded us, and I think if there's one thing I'd like to say with his last year in office, and as someone who's been a registered independent his whole life and has been invited to testify before Congress from both sides of the political spectrum, I am going to miss his conciliatory and diverse embrace of all Americans. And I think there are critics who will say our first African American president didn't do enough. My answer to that would be, no, we didn't do enough. So as he and Dr. King reminded us, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. But it does not bend on its own. You don't need a PhD or a JD to outreach your hands like those trees in Mississippi to the stars to say, we are going to bend the arc towards justice. Because if we don't, or if we are of such a mindset that we're going to say only politicians or only columnists or only professors have a role in it, then we are abandoning what makes America exceptional. Part of that bend of the arc of history must include diverse viewpoints, including those that I vigorously disagree with. And I think that we should start it here in the universities, where unlike any other place on earth, American universities have a special place where our jobs are guaranteed, not only for what we say, but for the tolerance for the ideas of others who we so vigorously disagree with. I think that is a role for us to play. And I am so honored to be part of that discussion here. It is not to be done by one person or one group alone. Reverend King's embrace of wanting to see the promised land meant that you have a role, no matter what your job is, no matter what your educational level, because they don't give PhDs in benevolence. Thank you so much for the privilege of coming here to one of the only places in the world, and if you don't think so, you go to Western Europe where they outlaw certain kinds of speech. You go to Russia, you go to Asia or Africa where people can be killed for either who they worship or what they say. And in the comfort of a beautiful high-tech room where our security is guaranteed by the heroes of our community, we have not only the right, but the responsibility to not only say what we think is right, but to have tolerance for views that may make us uncomfortable and that we vigorously disagree with. Thank you so much for the honor of being here today. Thank you. Thank you, fellow Quaker.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and he covered so many vital areas. We talked about the statistics. We talked about homegrown terrorists as well as extremism, hate. And now I'll open it up to some questions that you might have to him. And these questions are very broad. They can be just a comment. I'd like to hear from our students first and foremost. Feel free to ask our guest speaker a question that may have sparked your interest. If not, then I will proceed with questions. But certainly, we want to keep this open to students and or visitors. Don't all come at once.
I feel like my prom. Nobody? Sister Margaret?
Here we go. We have someone.
Jonathan Anderson. I think one of the things we're always challenged by with the concept of tolerance of opposing views is the degree of tolerance for intolerant views and the degree of what responsibility do we have to allow platforms for Holocaust denial, for anybody who believes things about anything, who believes that certain races are nothing but animals, or whatever it is. I struggle with the balance of tolerance while not enabling. I appreciate your thoughts.
Wow, what a great question. And interesting enough, I did an op-ed for USA Today after a fellow named Benjamin Smith murdered the Northwestern University basketball coach and a Korean Christian parishioner in an adjoining state. And the head of the group that assassin belonged to was called World Church of the Creator, a vigorously anti-Semitic, racist group that promotes the most horrible form of intolerance. And they had Matt Hale, the head of that group, on the Today Show. And what I wrote was, I think it's important to have him on. But, as you said, we don't have to give him unlimited time. Free speech does not mean that someone is guaranteed the most efficient, effective, paid platform. That being said, with regard to Holocaust denial, I was an expert witness involving a British case with the world's foremost Holocaust denier named David Irving. And I later went to Britain and did an interview with the BBC. And he was actually sought for arrest because there are hate speech laws in Europe. And I vigorously opposed his arrest. The marketplace of ideas must accept stupidity. Democracy is hard work. It's your job to vet things. the government, who are we going to have decide what is an acceptable idea? In the United States, we have a very carefully and thoughtfully constructed rule, which says there are certain types of expression that we are going to allow to be punished. Commercial fraud, incitement to imminent lawlessness, obscenity, and traditional crimes like conspiracy. But the world has learned over millennia that punishing viewpoints, opinions, and misrepresentations of educational fact is a road that we should not go to, because we might like it when there's a president that we enjoy. We might not like it when it's one that we disagree with. And the first people that have their speech denied are not only the haters, but the vulnerable. And this was stirred into my cereal, interestingly enough, by two people. One was a professor I had at Penn who was the first African-American federal judge in 30-some-odd years. And when he was subject to appointment by President Kennedy, a Southern senator said, there's not going to be any N-words appointed to the judiciary when I'm on the bench. The other was a constitutional law professor I had at Stanford, who, interestingly enough, taught Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg at different ends of their career. He escaped Nazi Germany, and he was quite vigorous in the protection of free speech, including hate speech. We have made some limitations, though. For instance, in a workplace, someone cannot be subject to repetitive speech which rises to harassment and makes for a hostile work environment. But if somebody wants to go around and say the Holocaust never happened, they have every right to. I'm also happy to report, or not happy to report, I shouldn't say that, but I'm also compelled to report that a fellow named Bradley Smith, one of the nation's most prodigious Holocaust deniers on college campuses, just died this week. So I'm sure there will be others that take his place. But we have to allow hateful and incorrect speech to exist. However, that does not mean, as academics, we must tolerate people who say the earth is flat as a matter of academic rigor. But as far as the expression of opinions, I think it is incumbent upon a free society to protect the right not only of speech we like, but also of the rights of neo-Nazis. And one of the things that I've done is, in certain instances, whether it be with regard to hate speech, or even folks who were neo-Nazis and white supremacists who were subject to the death penalty, when no one else would step up, I stepped up. But it's not necessarily a very pleasant place to be.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Very nice.
Wow.
Any others? Oh, we have one over here.
Hi, Alex Casadas, Human Resources. Growing on in politics is the biggest kind of conception of scapegoating refugees and the idea of security. What is your take as far as ethnicity, terrorism, and how that debate's going on currently with inviting Syrian refugees within our borders? How do you feel that? How do you feel that takes effect, and what's your stance on that particular item?
Well, when you say what's my I want to be clear. What is my stance on what? Just as someone who's an attorney, I always like to make sure I'm actually answering the question asked as opposed to the question I think was asked.
So what is your stance on the idea of national security versus the aspect of, say, allowing people from a different particular region who hold particular beliefs or ethnicity coming into the States, and how do you feel that debate is?
As refugees, or you see, as refugees, because there have been comments with respect to refugees. There's also been a statement by a presidential candidate saying that we should ban all people from a particular faith, and I want to make sure I'm addressing your question.
I guess that whatever question you feel more comfortable answering, because there's so many different ways that people take it, and so I guess either one would be fine however you want to take it, because I think those questions are going multiple different venues, and are moving on quite along around the media.
I'll address the easiest one first, just like my students always do, and then hope the bell rings. With respect to Mr. Trump's assertion that we should ban all Muslims entering the United States. So if Kareem Abdul-Jabbar goes to Oxford, he can't come back? Or Malala Yousaf wants to address the rights of women in the Middle East. We shouldn't have her come in? Or didn't we have a Nobel Prize winner from 2004 just come to speak in October? I guess she would be banned too. You know, I love my chair because he's always let me do what I do, and he knows I have an objective way of looking at things. He's from Kentucky, and he has a very erudite way of expressing things. And one of the things he told me the other week when we were discussing just, you know, the world today, he said, the problem with stupid people is they don't know they're stupid. What would a ban on Muslims entering the United States accomplish? So we wouldn't have the King of Jordan come in. We wouldn't have some of our allies come in. We wouldn't have some of the top scholars come in. And also, my son's dentist, he has an appointment tomorrow. She wouldn't be able to come back either. In fact, I pride myself, when I went to a forum some years ago about roots of extremism and democracy in the Muslim world, first thing I did was invite people that I met there to come here. And guess what? I invited an Iranian scholar to come address the campus. Interesting enough, you know what he said to me? He said, don't call the press because this may not bode well for me back home. And we had an exchange. It is the height of prejudice and retrograde to isolate people by faith. It is un-American. And if you don't believe me, listen to what President Washington said when he wrote the Thoreau Synagogue in Rhode Island in 1791. He said, we give to bigotry no sanction and to prejudice no existence. And Thomas Jefferson, who said that each person shall exist under their own tree and comport themselves as good citizens. That is how they should be judged. And if you look at Jefferson's tombstone, he did not put that he wanted to be remembered as the President of the United States. He put author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, and author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. This is not only something that is retrograde with regard to how we're viewed by the very allies we need to fight the extremist fringe in the world. There are only 30,000 ISIS fighters. Do people bastardize scripture and use that as a base for theological extremism? Absolutely. I've interviewed the head of the Jewish Defense League, who was quite critical of me and threatened to sue me, and told him that what he was doing was wrong, and that how could he promote someone who shot worshipers at a mosque, and how disgusting he was. And he responded in kind. But we have to be educated enough to understand that there are 1.4 billion Muslims in the world. And this was a faith that translated the Greek classics, that lit the roadways of Europe. And much to my son's protestation, invented algebra. To say that we're going to create a caste system here, I would hearken back in closing on this particular question to what Associate Justice Marshall said in his dissent in Plessy, and what he said in 1896. And by the way, the only member of the Supreme Court that went to a state university, Transylvania State, which doesn't even exist anymore. And he said, we have no caste system here. Under the law, civil rights regards man as man, his words. And this decision one day will come down as one of the most egregious since Dred Scott. He never lived to see his view. He never saw that promised land vindicated on May 17, 1954, when the separate but equal doctrine was trashed into the dustbin of history. With regard to Syrian refugees, what kind of a time are we living in when a 3-year-old can wash up dead on the Turkish shores, his little limbs dangling, and we have a presidential candidate say that he would shut the door to even a 5-year-old orphan? To be sure, there are two sides of this debate, but whether it's immigration or terrorism, we know which side is poisoned by prejudice. There's a litmus test of common sense that we can apply. Since 2001, we have had 784,000 refugees come into the United States. 3 have been charged in the past with terrorist-related crimes. No Syrians, to the best of my knowledge, and another 3 more recently. We have seen over the past year, however, ISIS, and I testified before Congress about this, that they are now targeting refugees. And we've actually seen them use people who have posed as refugees to re-enter Europe. But it's a bit of a different schematic because of the borders with respect to Europe. That being said, FBI Director Comey, in October of last year, testified before Congress that for some coming out of the Syrian theater, it is impossible to vet with any objective data because it doesn't exist. So I think we have to make a balancing test. But I think we have to come from a place where we say America has to stand for the downtrodden. That is what the Statue of Liberty says. And not just say we're going to shut the door no matter what. We might have to make some serious changes with regard to conscription-age males or with people who we don't have complete information on. We just had 100 people killed in the last 24 hours in bombings in Syria. Are we going to say we're going to turn our backs even on the children? And that is something that I went on CNN International and said, we have to work to develop something where we're not closing the door completely, but also regard people of goodwill who are not bigots and say that some of their facts with respect to ISIS changing their strategy is accurate. There's room for positive discourse here.
And on that note, I have a question for you. Excellent. Let's just talk a little bit about Ferguson, just a little bit, just to change things up. In your view, what was the root cause for the uprising in Ferguson? And I believe that I'd like you to clarify if you feel that it was associated with racial profiling or if it was the economic incentive that many in the law enforcement saw as an easy way to increase revenue. So it's both questions, but if you can take a stab at either or, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. I come from an unusual background. Someone who's attained some kind of deserved or undeserved recognition with regard to civil liberties. And I've trained police around the world. We had a program set up for years where we trained police on hate and extremism over the internet. And by the way, I thank Cal State for giving me the opportunity to do that. We can't fight bigotry by broad brushing law enforcement. Half of the departments in the United States consist of 10 or fewer people. If you look at some of the data, though, with respect to how certain police departments are run, Ferguson, and it came out in a devastating report by Department of Justice, were using small violations for extreme revenue generation, particularly for people who were not well-versed in legalities and could not pay these Herculean fines. In addition, in a community that was overwhelmingly majority African American. I believe there are only 3 African American officers. So what we must do is look at police departments like any other organizational entity. How is it run? What are their policies? What are their practices? What are their rules? And what is their operation with respect to inclusion? And it's clear that Ferguson has had a big problem with finding the community that they serve as a revenue-generating operation. It came out quite clear in that report. And there's data that shows the counties, how much revenue is generated per citizen, and Ferguson was way high. When you have a community that feels that they are not connected to the institutions of that community, you do not have that cushion of trust. And what happened with respect to the shooting there started in an atmosphere where the trust had evaporated. And while the Justice Department did, under Eric Holder, who I had the privilege of speaking with, who is a former judge, they could not find that the evidence existed with respect to the use of force that resulted in a tragic death. But what they did find are patterns and practices and employment that run counter to what the law requires. And they are now suing Ferguson because Ferguson would not agree to certain conditions of the consent decree. So whether it's Cal State, whether it's our legal system, whether it's the Motion Picture Academy, let's hold everyone in our society to the same standards. We are all failing with respect to racial equity. However, policies, training, procedures, issues with regard to use of force, all of these things are part of the evolving process of how we should be policing. And let me just say, I believe out of the 8 homicides against police officers that exist so far this year, 7 were done by white folks. And what have we been seeing lately? As law enforcement has diversified a bit, last year we saw a disturbing number of people of color who were in law enforcement gunned down. So while certainly there are issues with regard to prejudice and also implicit bias. Implicit bias is where the real research is going today. The Klan is, even with 190 chapters today, is a shadow of its former self. When people like President Harry Truman or Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black or Senator Robert Byrd belonged to them, and they were burning African Americans in the streets of East St. Louis. And they had 4.5 million members. 1 in 7 members of the electorate were tied to the Klan. Those days are over. But what we do have are these implicit biases, and that's something that we have to address. With regard to hate offenders, the most common type of hate offenders are thrill offenders who have shallow prejudices and may even have relationships with people from different groups. But they respond to stereotypes that when they're seeking peer validation or they're intoxicated or under pressure, will respond that way. And I think a lot has to be done. But what I would say is that this is not simply a law enforcement problem. And it's something that we have to have all interested stakeholders in meaningful discussions with regard to use of force, but also prejudice, but also enforcement. Let me just say one last thing. We saw recently some right-wing militants take over a wildlife refuge in eastern Oregon. Some of their complaints were similar. And what I'm saying is, I am not justifying incivil conduct, but I think it is fair to say, and we're seeing in both ends of the political spectrum, from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump, people who feel that the government and the institutions that used to bind us together are not being responsive. And we have to make sure, whether it's a rancher in Nevada or a citizen in Indianapolis, that they feel that the government is listening to them and that they have a say.
Thank you. And we will end on that. Thank you so much. We greatly appreciate your input and your knowledge. Thank you so much for our questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You are a joy.
Thanks, everyone. It was great having you here. Thank you for your participation. We do have an evaluation sheet with the input, a space for input. We'd like to get your feedback. We also like to hear from you in terms of what other
about the